In fact, it's the ultimate power grab by the central planners
Mhm.
to control the monetary system in a centralized fashion. That is the difference. And sort of obstacles on the way are cash and the banks, because currently the banks are creating most of the money, and the central planners don't like it.
Yeah.
They want to increase their power. And so that's why we've had already for a decade or so this war on cash, this ongoing war on cash. Cash is bad and it's all terrorism. And if you're paying too much in cash, you must be doing something illegal. It's complete nonsense that you have nowhere else to go. And the central bank can simply book money away from you. It'll be called something, there'll be a rationale, negative rate, or it can be punishment because you've been watching too much Neil McCoy-Ward, you know. Who knows what? Are you buying the wrong books, or
Mm.
you're buying too much meat, or your carbon footprint. I mean, any story can be used as an excuse, asking the banks, how are you going to make money to move into real estate big way, so that
Yeah.
something that they hadn't done for a century, but already prices have significantly come down, probably 10% plus.
Yeah.
Usually with these bubbles, they go down 70, 80% if it's a proper bubble, and then afterwards you get your proper collapse. And
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very special interview discussion today with Professor Richard Werner, or Werner if you are German. So this is going to be a fantastic discussion. I want to just give a quick intro before I bring you on, Richard, here. So you're the inventor of QE, what we know as quantitative easing, and the quantity theory of disaggregated credit. You're going to have to tell us what that means in a moment for everybody. Author of the #1 Japanese bestseller, Princes of the Yen, which is a very famous book. I think you were beating Harry Potter for a while. I remember it at the time. You have first class honors from the London School of Economics, directorate from Oxford University. You have various professorships throughout the world. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's so much here that you have done. So, firstly, welcome to the channel here, Richard.
thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're most welcome. And I will tell people about some of your things, how they can follow you more at the end. But just very briefly, quantumpublishers.com for your book, The Princes of Yen. You're on X, and you also have your own website. We'll come to that later on for all those people that want to follow you there. So I've got quite a lot of questions for you today, and this is more for the people that are interested in perhaps the future, more of the financial angle of the channel, because often I talk a lot about news because there's so much crazy, insane news every day at the moment that the channel seems to be geared towards keeping people up to speed so they're not getting destroyed by some of these dystopian sort of measures coming through. And we were just talking offline, and I was quite surprised to find that as a professor, that you agree with a lot of our views here. So I think people are going to enjoy listening to what you have to say. So there's so much that we could start with. I know you're quite well known as well for talking about the city of London. I saw a clip on that earlier today, quite a viral clip there. So there's so much we can talk about. But I really want to begin, I think, with the biggest hitting question that will be on everyone's mind. And that is around the Western economies. Most of my subscribers are in the West. I think there's a very big concern there for not just societal, political, but also financial. And I just want to know, if you were to look out 5, 10 years, 20 years, how are you seeing the economics, the finances for Western democracies? Are you seeing a boom? Are you seeing a bust? Are you seeing a pendulum swing to Asia with their GDP growth? Can we start by talking about that? How are you seeing Western economies?
Yes, well, starting with Europe, which I think where a lot of the action is taking place, and where of course the largest economy is Germany. Um, that's really quite representative of what is happening. Namely, we see a massive destruction of economic and social value, and wholesale deindustrialization going on. And essentially, it seems that decision makers are very keen to destroy Germany in every possible way. So that's ongoing. And of course, it's similar in neighboring countries, whether you're looking at Austria or, other European countries. It is very much like Henry Kissinger once said, it's bad to be America's enemy, but it is fatal to be America's ally.
Mm,
So
mm,
this is really what's happening. Um, the Germany is really made to suffer, um, and the policies implemented are just, I mean, I don't know what word to use. Insane, lunatic, I don't know. Self-destructive would perhaps be a sort of very modest and neutral one. So we've got really bad macroeconomic policies. Of course, the background is, what's happened in recent years. I mean, this is sort of the progression of already bad policies in recent years, and they're just when you think they can't get worse, they manage to actually um, make it worse. I mean, unbelievable. Um, Obviously, there's these 2020 policies to um, destroy the sort of medium-sized companies and the middle class through restrictive policies that were unimaginable just a few years ago. I mean, how can you restrict human rights, basic human rights so drastically? That's one thing. Um, but then also at the same time, this inflation was created on purpose. And
mm,
that's what my work shows. I mean, it's been intentional. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And a coordinated effort and the usual hierarchy. So the US was calling the shots, the Federal Reserve, and it instructed the other central banks in the sort of American empire to follow suit. And this is exactly what happened. And you can prove that looking at the details. And so then the inflation that followed was completely predictable. I mean, I was out there in May 2020 when the data came out. They're saying, well, we're going to have significant inflation in roughly 18 months' time because it does take its time to work through the system. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. Now, I did not forecast the military action that's been going on in Ukraine since 2014, roughly, to escalate in the way it has. And therefore, that's not a factor in my forecast. You
mm,
know,
mm,
people say, "Oh, it's Putin's inflation," right? It's what we're told from America. Putin's price hike. Well, no. It's like the 70s. The narrative in the 1970s. In fact, maybe it's a good place to start because this is, we have to really revisit some of the things that we thought are true for sure. It turns out they aren't actually true either. So everyone agrees the 70s, well, that was the decade of inflation because of the oil shock, oil price hike, supply shock, embargo, and triggered by a war. In other words, the same scenario they're selling us now, right? There's a war, there's embargo,
mm,
there's energy, gas and oil supply shocks, therefore we have inflation. And it's sort of, it has a logic, it seems convincing. But just because something is logical and could be true doesn't mean it is true. And so in the 1970s, what really happened is because you see, the inflation happened um, earlier, before the war in the
mm,
Middle East that triggered this OPEC oil embargo. That war was only in mid-October uh, uh, 1973. And then oil prices didn't go up for a while. In fact, again, Henry Kissinger had to intervene personally and arm twist the Saudi Arabian oil minister to quadruple the oil price because he thought quadruple, that's too much, that's outrageous. No, no, you must. It was the Americans pushing hard for that. This is only later became apparent, when various records got declassified. Um, and so the timing is anyway off for the story to work because the inflation already took place I mean, in Germany, more or less peaked in the middle of the year 1973. And some other countries slightly different, but basically a lot of the inflation happened really before October 1973 and well before January 74, when on Henry Kissinger's pressure, they quadrupled the oil price. That's January 74. So what really was causing the inflation? Well, you just need to look at money creation. If you look at the money creation, that suddenly was kick-started, actually already starting in late 1972, and often it peaked in early 73, and there's always a lag. So then you get the inflation. From the 72 money creation, massive money creation. And this was a coordinated effort. Of course, the story there was decoupling the dollar from gold. I mean, it was always only a theoretical link to gold. But when the French made good on this, and they said, well, hang on, because there was this fixed exchange rate system, everyone's currency was linked to the US dollar at a fixed rate, and the dollar was the core, and the Americans abused that privileged position by just printing a lot of dollars and using that to purchase assets in Europe, companies, property, real estate, anything you want. They were buying it with the printed dollars. Now, everyone had to shut up and be quiet because, Germany has US occupied US troops in the country, couldn't complain about that. But France was not part of NATO, didn't have US troops. And they spoke up and said, hang on, they're just printing dollars and buying us up. What can we do? And they complained. And then there is one thing they could do. They could say, well, all these dollars accumulating with us, we're going to change them to gold. That was possible according to the old system, Bretton Woods system. And there was some dramatic scenes where French Navy ships moved into Manhattan, docked, and then the captain and his crew, their job was to literally walk to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and get the French gold out.
Yeah.
So once they started to do that, it didn't take long. And then in August 1971, Richard Nixon gave his famous speech and says that in order to protect the US dollar from speculators, we're going to temporarily suspend convertibility into gold, temporarily. And the politicians, they said, of course, to defend the dollar. So the moment he did this, of course, the dollar collapsed. Now, so then they reacted in the following way. Number one, the Fed instructed all the other central banks that it had some sway over, which is Five Eyes plus, Europe, particularly Germany, to massively print money, you see. Because the dollar's collapsing, how can you stop it? Well, if the other guys are also now massively printing money, then that will soften and slow the collapse in the dollar. And that's what happened. So everywhere you see central banks massively expanding. And that was step one. And the step two was, because, of course, the dollar is fundamentally weak because America wasn't selling enough of its products abroad and had this huge trade deficit and budget deficit. And the two big trade surplus countries were Germany and Japan. And they were not buying enough American stuff, but the Americans figured out, they need something. They need oil. That was a big import item for Germany and Japan. So we're going to make sure we're in control of oil. And so American troops moved to Saudi Arabia, Kissinger, negotiating with this Al Saud family. And it's a bit like a protection racket, that Americans turning up and saying, oh, it's a nice country you have here. It's nice and peaceful. Isn't it good? Stable rule of wouldn't it be a shame if this changed? Well, we're here to protect you. If you want to sign up. And then the deal was done. You only sell oil against the US dollar. And also, as was later revealed when these things were declassified, 80% of the Saudi Arabian oil revenue had to be, that was part of this deal, reinvested in US treasuries. And that's how they plugged also the budget deficit for the massive military spending. So that was the 70s. That was the inflation. It was actually caused by the money printing of central banks. And the oil shock was arranged afterwards as a sort of excuse, the official narrative. And really on direct American intervention. And that way they had a massive transfer of wealth from Europe to America because suddenly everything was going up in Europe. There was rationing, even, oil, um,
Right. That's right.
petrol rationing. Now the story is the same. And so, of course, this is really what happened in 2020. Now, most people are not aware of that, but if you look at the data in March 2020, the Federal Reserve was the core of this, but simultaneously the other central banks, in Europe, ECB, Bank of Japan, they all did the same thing, and they massively expanded their money creation. Now, you mentioned earlier, I made the original proposal for quantitative easing, but this proposal has two versions or there's two types of QE. The Japanese situation for which I made this was disastrous. It was clear the banking system had created too much money for property speculation in the 80s, was going to go bust. I mean, I warned of that in 91 already, when most people thought this is crazy. Japan is going to take over the world. What's this guy talking about? There's no way Japan's banks are going to go bust and they're going to move into recession. It was quite clear to me. And then what you need to do to get out of it very quickly is number one, the central bank buys the non-performing assets from the banks. You move them to the central bank balance sheet, and then you forget about, of course, you buy them at face value or something much higher than market value. Problem solved. But the banks will be so shell-shocked, they won't, continue to create credit. There will be a shock still. It will take a while. And so that's why I had my second version of QE. So the first step is for the central bank to purchase non-performing assets from banks. And the second version is to kickstart bank credit. The central bank can push money into the economy by purchasing performing assets from non-banks, anything, securities, corporate bonds, even real estate I was proposing in Japan. And that way, when their accounts get credited at the banks create this credit, they get, credit with the central bank. That's how it works. And that's how the central bank can push money straight into the economy. Now, that's for this hugely deflationary situation. That's why we invented it, right? The economy shrinking, deflation. But they did it in March 2020, this second version of QE, which is very aggressive. And of course, if bank credit was already growing by 5%, the economy was doing okay, and they did this on top. So then you had a massive expansion in the money supply. It's very clear, well, it will take a year or so, 18 months to work its way through the system, but it's going to give us significant inflation. And that's what they did. And now, and I'm sorry, it's a slightly long answer to your question, but it's sort of, this is the destruction, the ongoing destruction and transfer of wealth out of Europe, that of course then was accelerated. But then on top we have all these other disastrous policies. I mean, there's of course the open door policy for immigration, and then there's all the policies imposed on Europe by the Americans that hurt European economies, but they're designed to somehow, as part of this ongoing battle with Russia, to damage Russia, which they don't. They don't damage Russia. Russia's economy is doing great. Russia has just overtaken Germany as the largest European economy. That's how well Russia is doing. And Germany is now, the economy is really collapsing because companies are just moving out, lock, stock, and barrel, just moving factories out, jobs being lost, because energy prices now, shot up drastically because the Russian energy is not allowed. It wasn't that the Russians weren't exporting. They would have delivered reliably and continue to deliver reliably to Germany as they did throughout the Cold War. But that was, Germany cut it off, and Europe was forced by America to cut off this energy supply. And so now the economy is going down the drain, and there's no, on the horizon, we have no change towards any better policies, because if you look at these actors, I mean, they are hired actors, bad actors. There's just no change visible. So it's a very negative outlook, but it's not one that just happens to come about. It's designed destruction, which is really, I mean, it's crazy. It's pretty insane, but they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad a professor of economics of your level has confirmed what I've been saying just by applying logic and common sense to the
Very
situation
good.
for a long
Exactly.
time. I mean, I have 7 or 8 questions just from what you talked about. So I'm going to go into a couple of the key ones and then we'll loop back, I think, because there's so much. See, I don't want to get too much into QE and bank deposits and
Sure.
creation of currency because, I mean, it takes a long time to understand that these things and
It's
sometimes
actually simple. I mean, we can talk about it. I will be brief and simple. It is simple.
okay.
It is literally, one can think of this money creation. It's the same as printing money, except nowadays money is digital, but it has the same effect.
Mm,
And of course, there's the other aspect. Actually, printed money, physical money is freedom, and we should cherish it. So let me just
yeah,
emphasize that.
cash.
The digital money can be used as a control tool and is increasingly being used.
And
So
it will
yeah,
be. It will be used as a control tool. Okay, so I want to go on to another question I had then as you were talking. And I think it's important to address because you talked about this, but I think the question that some people might have had down their mind is what was on my mind. So we talked about how America did create unparalleled levels of QE, which is new currency. So they created all this new currency, which caused inflation. And you mentioned how the other countries around the world also did that. But here's the question: if we think about currency valuation, yen against the dollar, euro against dollar, British pound, what would have happened had those other countries not done that currency creation? What would have happened to the value of the dollar versus those other currencies?
yes. Well, so certainly in the 70s, it would have, we would have seen a much more dramatic fall in the dollar. I mean, the dollar did fall,
Mm,
but the fall was sort of then, slowed and cushioned. And that's the effect, it had because the other central banks were dramatically revving up their money creation. And then they needed this other narrative as a cover because they didn't want people to really notice what was going on. That
mm,
and then also the hierarchy behind this, like they were ordered to create inflation for the sake of America and for the sake of the dollar, and it's really transferred well from Europe to America and also Japan to America going on, and that's where this whole oil shock scenario came in, and suddenly, I mean, until today, that's what they're writing about. So it definitely the dollar would have collapsed much more dramatically and would have therefore weakened America's position in the world, including, all the very expensive foreign wars and military operations abroad, which are
yeah, yeah.
funded by this dollar creation.
I agree. So then that raises the question then, was this coordinated in that the US said, we're going to do this currency creation and you need to do it as well, or else the dollar is going to have very big problems and weaker? Or was it a case of these other central bankers said, okay, look, the US is doing it, so we may as well do it as well, because otherwise our trade, our currency is going to be too expensive compared to theirs. We're going to lose exports. We're going to, there's going to be all these other issues. That's the thing that I've been pondering. Was it the chicken or the egg on that? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yes. Well, I think, I mean, with Germany, it's quite clear because there literally is a hierarchy of, who's in charge. Um, the Federal Republic of Germany is a temporary construct
Yeah,
created during the time of foreign occupation. And when it was created, this was literally, written everywhere. And, even because when you're occupied, your constitution gets suspended and you get a temporary basic law. And this basic law, which is still in place, says this is a temporary construct. I mean, even now, I mean, they slightly changed it in 91, but even now it says, Article 146, once the Germans are, ready for it and want to be sovereign, they can call a constitutional assembly and give themselves a constitution, and then you'd be a sovereign country again, which is not happening. So I mean, the occupation statutes from 1945 are still being used by America to exert its control, and the Americans love it. I mean, all the big bases they have in Germany, they're running their Middle Eastern wars from there. control centers for the drone attacks, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
The CIA, they're all active and they love it because it's legal based on the occupation statutes. Whereas in other countries, this sort of stuff mostly is illegal what they're doing. And so,
yeah,
so you have that entrenched reality that Germany is not a sovereign country, and that really America is running the show, by stealth through Germany. And the German leadership, in inverted commas, is not a leadership. They're just the occupation administration. They have to do what the Americans say. But even the creation of this united, Europe, that's an American project, and these CIA files have been declassified. All the original founders, Jean Monnet and Schumann Spark, they were all CIA assets, and and Jean Monnet has been writing about in his autobiography that we won't reveal the full agenda, that we want to create a European super state that is undemocratic,
yeah.
because people won't like it. And it's a big puzzle. I mean, how would democratic countries? I mean, you can figure out or understand how they decide. Let's move together and be one. Although that wasn't really. I mean, in Germany, there was never a referendum about any of all that. But why would the new construct then be undemocratic? And not have proper parliament. And the European Parliament is like the Soviet Parliament. The Soviet Union had a parliament, but they just could not propose any laws. So
Mm,
that was all done by the Politburo, unelected. That's the European Commission.
yeah, sure.
And so the answer to that puzzle is it's because the Americans created this as their tool to run Europe. By running the European Commission, they can run Europe. And of course, Germany's been their power base. Um, so that's why it's quite clear, the instructions came from the US to do this. Now, we also know this because when you look at the data, I mean, it's a very unusual policy that's maybe only taken once in a century or maybe maximum twice in a century. This particular policy which created inflation, where the central bank buys assets from non-banks, because normally central banks don't work with non-banks.
Right.
So it's a very unusual tool. But then if suddenly at the same time, in the same month, all these central banks do it at the same time, then of course it's coordinated. And how does this coordination work? Well, we can work backwards. Who is the first giving the initiative? Well, it started in August 2019 at the Jackson Hole Conference, where the central bankers gather. Federal Reserve, invites various speakers, and they invited BlackRock. BlackRock presented. And BlackRock presented my QE2, the second version of QE. And it's interesting, you can still see this on the internet. Their proposal from August 2019 says there will be another crisis. I mean, that's an easy prediction.
Mm,
But when this crisis comes, this time we must create inflation. And here's how we're going to do it. They never explain why, and that's not even questioned, which is kind of strange. And then they say, how are we going to get this inflation? Well, the central bank will purchase assets from the non-bank sector and therefore unify central bank policy with fiscal policy. They
yeah,
call it going direct.
can you just explain to everyone what you mean when you say the non-bank sector?
Yes. Well, one has to just understand what actually most people know by common sense, that banks are special. Now, economics textbooks deny this. They pretend banks are not special, but that's part of the cover up. Banks are special.
Mm,
And therefore, you have to distinguish, when you have a banking license, you have certain powers that those without banking license don't have. And the main power is you can create money. So when a bank gives a loan, the money for that loan didn't exist beforehand. It's newly created by the bank, by each individual bank that gives a loan and added to the money supply. And that's enormous power, which is why we have to make sure we have the right type of banks and that they're doing the right type of decision, which is why it's always good to have local community banks that are locally meaningfully accountable to the local population. And then you get the right type of lending and the right type of money creation, as opposed to very big banks that are so big they're not accountable to anyone, and even the regulator has no idea what's happening or can have no idea under certain circumstances what's happening. So, and they're clearly not accountable. So, banks can create money. That makes them very special. And that's why in analysis, I distinguish between the bank sector and the non-bank sector. That means, they can't create money, the non-bank sector. And normally central banks only deal with the bank sector. For centuries, that's been the way it's been operating. It's like a two-tier system. The central bank only deals with the banks, and the banks deal with the public and the non-bank sector.
Right.
But, and that's why BlackRock called it going direct. My QE2 proposal was that's how you can inject money straight into the economy. It's via the banks, but, on decision of the central bank. If the central bank acts and purchases assets directly from the non-bank sector, circumventing the bank, so to speak, it goes out and says to a company, or you've issued these corporate bonds, we're going to buy them, or maybe issue some more and we'll buy them. And then how is the central bank paying this non-bank, just a company, say a manufacturer, whatever company, financial company, but not a bank, you see? Well, they don't have an account with the central bank, they have an account with the bank. And so it's just a normal bank transfer, it would appear. The central bank credits their account at their bank. And so then the bank gets credit at the central bank. That's called bank reserves, on the asset side of the bank. And on the liability side of the bank, that's where the deposit accounts are held.
Yeah.
And the bank creates literally new money there. And so this is a way for the central bank to force banks to create money and push it into the economy.
Yeah.
Because normally it's the banks that create money. Central banks only normally create 3% of the money supply, that's the paper money. And 97% is created by banks through this bank lending, bank credit is money creation. And so that's why it's important to distinguish between banks and non-banks.
It's interesting you say 97%, because I had the figures a little bit different to that, because I don't just see it as the commercial banks, but there's other organizations that we see that are now creating, especially the US. The US, I think, is very different to some of the other economies out there, but particularly in the US, and you have Fannie and Freddie, and have all these other I guess what would you refer to them as? Their government agencies,
Yes,
be now contributing to this as well. Would you?
yes, that's true.
Okay.
Yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. And also, even in America, mutual funds have a different status. They're essentially banks because you can have a check account, and they can, they've sort of crossed that border.
Yeah.
So it's slightly a broader definition in America.
Yeah.
But in principle, it's the same idea.
And of course, we also have to add that it's not just the creation of the new currency and capital, but it's with interest. And
well, that comes on top, exactly. Although, of course, until recently that was fairly low, but yes, and certainly analytically that has to be taken into consideration, which is why, because once you get an economy going, then essentially there is a bit of pressure to keep it going, because where's the money for the interest coming from? Just you need more growth and more money creation, and then partly that will be used to service the debt.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of linking through a few of the questions that I've got, so I'll go a little bit more granular on them now. And in terms of Europe, then let's just close the loop on Europe here. Do you see the euro surviving? Do you see it becoming a CBDC euro? How's that going to play in with other countries here? Do you even see Europe surviving? Because I'm very much on the fence here. I see Europe is collapsing right now, and I agree with you. A lot of it is, you look at the GDP of a country, what do you need? You need energy input for that, just to maintain that manufacturing and other things. And what we're seeing is, obviously, as you mentioned, the media, and again, I talked about this recently, it's bizarre to me that they're now turning around saying Putin cut us off when actually we know that the European Western nations sanctioned Russian energy because they didn't want to, be responsible for injecting money into the Russian military machine.
Well, that was sort of the official story, but um, for Germany, it was more direct. America wanted to sell its liquid gas and other, substitutes, which are much more expensive and did take much longer to actually be ready to be supplied in that volume. So it was actually impossible to substitute the Russian energy supplies, but still Germany had to cut itself off. And it was Germany saying to Russia, no, we're not going to take this. And of course, somebody blew up that Russian pipeline to Germany.
Yeah,
So,
what a
which the
mystery that
Americans said
was.
they will take down if that continues, that pipeline, we'll take it down. But
Yeah,
everyone is puzzled who could have done.
yeah. My subscribers aren't puzzled because I covered it in great detail within
Excellent.
days of it happening. So
Very good.
yeah, we won't go into that again. That was yeah, a very interesting topic. Okay, so in terms of Europe surviving, then, just to get us back to this, do you see the euro surviving? Do you see it transitioning to the CBDC euro? Or where do you see the actual
Yes,
euro as a currency under the ECB going?
exactly. Well, that's an excellent question. Well, there's two aspects to it. One is going back to this Jackson Hole conference, 2019. There was a second speech that was also landmark, a sort of quite indicative and important speech, and that was by Mark Carney, my
Hmm.
fellow student at Oxford in the MPhil in economics at the time. But he then chose to work for Goldman Sachs back office. How boring. But anyway, he did well for himself. So he gave this speech, and the speech is about how there is a threat to the global financial system, to the US dollar, and there'll be various digital currencies and cryptocurrencies, and therefore central banks should switch to CBDCs, and they should be then also linked to have a global currency as well, or some kind of composite, um, probably in addition, at least in the initial phase, which was, quite an important speech at that time, 2019, because not everyone was aware that there is this program by central banks to prepare to introduce central bank digital currencies. Um, and it's again similar to the 70s, because remember, the 70s inflation was really cover for rearranging the monetary system, while at the same time, of course, they wanted to rescue the dollar, but also rearranging the system, and they switched from the gold dollar to the petrodollar.
Hmm.
So now it's the same story. The inflation is the cover to hide this transfer of wealth from Europe to America, to shore up America and shore up the dollar, but also arrange for the new system, which this time seems to be the switch to CBDCs, as you say. And so that's one aspect in general. So that's clearly what they're all planning and working on, and the ECB is working hard at the Bank of England to be ready to roll out CBDCs. Um, but the second aspect is, but Europe itself is quite it's a fragile thing, because this euro has been a disaster from start to finish. I mean, I was opposing it before they introduced it, but at the time it was, I did get cancelled for that because it was a taboo topic. You can't criticize, introduction of a new European currency. Um, and so, yes, so will the euro survive? Well, of course, the plan is to switch to CBDCs, and in that sense, there will be something new. I mean, they could just call it digital euro. But the euro as a currency system, we have to just remember that these things are political, and the euro has always been political. It never made economic sense for any country, neither for Germany nor for any other country. The only justification ever was political. And in my view, that also didn't make sense, because ultimately then they're left without arguments. The only argument left was, oh no, but we need the euro in order to unite Europe so that there won't be another war and Germany won't have a war against the other European countries, or some story like that. It's pretty
Hmm.
ludicrous.
Yeah.
So the economics was always very much against it, and it didn't make sense. It's been hugely costly for everyone. I mean, it cost German industry a lot in terms of competitiveness because by definition, once you abolish the de facto European currency, which had become the European currency because it was the strongest, the D-mark, and if you abolish that and substitute with something that's an amalgam and of all the other
Mm,
currencies, by definition, it has to be weaker. So the euro, of course, immediately went, very soon became weak and weaker and weaker. A lot of people say that's great for Germany. That's nonsense. Germany thrived. Germany imports all its raw materials. It wants a strong currency to import them cheaply. It thrives
yeah.
by adding value and have high value added finished goods. And by constantly having an appreciating currency, there's pressure to always stay competitive, always implement the latest technologies and keep productivity high. And that worked really well. Japan had the same system, worked really well. But when you then have a decade or two of a weak currency, you're taking that pressure off. Companies feel no need to reinvest, no need to upgrade to the latest technology. You start to fall behind. So
Mm,
that's actually been bad. And of course, your international purchasing power goes down with a weak currency. Germany had one of the largest foreign reserves, but you're not, if your purchasing power as a currency to accumulate new foreign assets goes down when the currency weakens, and your raw material imports get more expensive. So Germany was also a loser, and it's very easy. And I explained that because most people think Germany was a winner. But of course, the other countries were also losers, and that's quite obvious. If you just look at Greece, what disaster they created there, Spain,
yeah.
Italy. Italy did okay when it could devalue the currency every so often, but by having the euro, that was taken away, and then it gets very painful.
Yeah.
So, and that means the euro economically it was always a disaster, but we have it, you see, which shows that it's the politics that dominates the currency system because people can be forced to have what is the wrong currency system and the wrong currency. So in that sense, it will hang on. The euro won't disappear while the political leadership wants it for
Yeah.
all the wrong reasons.
Okay. Okay. Let's move over, still on the thread of CBDCs then. So we've talked about, and I won't go into my theories around CBDCs because they are quite complex. I've covered them on the channel before. But I'm just writing a piece at the moment. We were talking offline about my private community, and I was saying about what you need to do for a private community. And you can't get away with just not creating no content. You've got to make detailed content. So I'm just writing a piece at the moment on CBDCs and how people can sort of escape, for those people who don't want to be part of this new system, how they can escape. I'm analyzing different countries and things like that, and crime and living standards and all these things, and looking at that at the moment. And I want to link that to what you said earlier. So we were talking about 1970s and 1980s high inflation, because what happened, we went from one system, gold backed dollars reserve currency, to a let's detach Nixon, let's take it off the gold standard. And now we've got gold, and now we've got currency, and we had very high levels of inflation. So I, again, done videos, so everybody watching, you can see on the channel these videos of analyzing the Bank of England, ECB, the Fed, in terms of these CBDCs and how they're going to be implemented. Now, here's the question I've got for you, Richard, then linking to this. If you look at everything we just talked about, the high inflation, off the gold backed, what do you think is going to happen when they implement these CBDCs in whatever country, but let's stick to the West, and you've still got the fiat? So you've now got CBDC, you've got fiat, and how on earth are they going to do that transition? Are they going to have, I mean, you're German, so you remember you probably understand quite well Weimar, and you had the Rentenmark and the Deutschmark, and sometimes you might have two polar currencies running side by side. How do you think this is going to work? And run with this as much as you want. Do you see high inflation as a result? Do you see fiat having to be closed down? Let's link this to cash. Just go for it.
Yeah, okay. Well, so the goal is to introduce this central bank digital currency. Now, the name itself already is part of the marketing of this. The idea is to suggest there's something new. The reality is we've been using BDC, bank digital currencies, for decades. So that's not new. And the BDC, the bank digital currencies, are working quite well. It's a good payment system. There's no issue. And people who have analyzed this, I mean, there's a study by McKinsey and others looking at the CBDC proposal. It's quite funny because they're right. They're actually, well, there seems to be no need for it because currently, things are going well. There's this one Federal Reserve Bank governor in the US, Neil Kashkari, I think in Minneapolis. He's openly said and quite correctly said that, oh, CBDC seems to be a solution for a problem we don't have. Like, why do we need it? We have bank digital currencies. So what is the difference? The difference is the central aspect. It is a um, a reach for power. In fact, it's the ultimate power grab by the central planners
Mm-hmm.
to control the monetary system in a centralized fashion. That is the difference. And the enemies and sort of obstacles on the way are cash and the banks. Because currently the banks are creating most of the money and the central planners don't like it.
Yeah.
They want to increase their power. And so that's why we've had already for a decade or so this war on cash, this ongoing war on cash. Cash is bad and it's all terrorism. And if you're paying too much in cash, you must be doing something illegal. It's complete nonsense. But all sorts of excuses are being used. And by the way, in that process, in this war on cash, they have actually said on the record, the central bankers and the PR spokesman for the central planners have said, oh, it'd be good to abolish cash because then we can impose negative interest rates because
Yeah.
people have nowhere else to go. And of
Yeah.
course, that is one of the goals of CBDCs, that you have nowhere else to go, and the central bank can simply book money away from you. It'll be called something. There'll be a rationale, negative rate, or it can be punishment because you've been watching too much Neil McCoy-Ward. Who knows what? Are you buying the wrong books, or
Mm.
you're buying too much meat, or your carbon footprint. I mean, any story can be used as an excuse. And of course, the climate change story is likely to be used because they're really investing a lot in marketing that sort of concept. And they think maybe they can get a bit of buy-in using that. But it's a control tool.
Mm.
And so that means, of course, they want to get rid ultimately of cash and the banks because they're the competition. Now, with the banks, the reality is central banks can and have created banking crises in the past galore. I mean, they do this all the time.
Yeah.
I see a banking crisis coming in Germany in the next 2 to 3 years. Now, the timing is tricky because, I mean, Japan has shown you can stretch it out for a decade. I mean, I warned of the collapse of the Japanese banking system in 1991. It was acknowledged in 2003. That was sort of the official peak of the banking crisis. So they've stretched it for over a decade. Of
Mm.
course, already a few years down the road, people realize, yeah, it is a banking crisis in slow motion taking place there. And then that timing depends on policy variables. So that's hard to predict. So it could, of course, be slower, but certainly the ECB seems to me, to have enough incentive for it to happen maybe in 2, 3 years' time. The story behind this is the usual one. I mean, they usually replay the same old scenarios. So the German banks have been forced more or less by the ECB and its policies and its informal meetings asking the banks, how are you going to make money, to move into real estate big way. So that
Yeah.
something that they hadn't done for a century. I mean, it hadn't been a real estate bubble in Germany for a century. And that's why it's clear to me in 2009, I told everyone, buy German property, it's going to go up because they're going to create an asset bubble. There weren't that many places that didn't have an asset bubble for many decades. Germany was one of them. And because Germany was going to be the target of the next banking crisis, which comes after the asset bubble. So the banks get exposed, creating all this money. That's what's driving up the asset prices because bank lending is money creation, pushing up the asset prices. And then you just need a trigger. And the trigger came, autumn last year, the very rapid interest rate rises, which do affect, property calculations, for
Yeah.
and of course the late coming investors in property then had a problem. You start to get a pullback there, get some bankruptcies, first non-performing loans in property. But the banks, most of all, reducing lending for property. And that means property prices don't rise anymore. There's simply a function of bank lending for property purchases. When
Correct.
that stops, and it has stopped, then property prices start to go down. Now, initially, it takes a while because the current owners don't want to sell. They don't want to realize the loss. So that's where, it can be stuck for a while. There are buyers, but they want to, buy at a lower price.
Yeah.
And so that's what's currently happening, is a bit frozen. But already prices have significantly come down, probably 10% plus.
Yeah.
Usually with these bubbles, they go down 70, 80% if it's a proper bubble, and then afterwards you get your proper collapse. Of course, for the banking system, you only need asset prices from the peak, because they've gone up by 100, 200, 300%. From the peak, they only need to drop by 15, 20%, and the banking system is more or less wiped out because
Yeah.
it had been overexposed. And any losses, non-performing loans have to come from equity. Bank equity is small, 10%.
Mm.
So, you're quickly wiped out. That's why we have the recurring banking crisis, and that's going to happen in Germany. So I see that as an important scenario. But that's ideal, you see, to
Mm.
introduce CBDCs, isn't it? I mean, you want a banking crisis, because then and you can easily big it up as a central bank. I mean, there's anything you can, it's quite easy to do that. Then suddenly you create this panic, and people want to pull out their money from the banks. And oh, there is an alternative, CBDCs. And that's how you can not just introduce CBDCs, but make them apparently, successful, seemingly successful, and you then shut down the banking system. That is clearly one of the scenarios I think they're pondering and working on. There's some other ways you could also do it, but that's probably one of the
Okay.
central scenarios.
Interesting, because I mean, that theory had obviously crossed my mind at one point, but I decided to go with another theory for the transition. I'm probably going to make that my title of the video or something here now, Richard. It's like Richard's 70, 80% collapse. Oh gosh. But my theory is more around a cyber attack. And we're seeing a lot of this at the moment. We just saw it last week with MGM
Yeah.
and some of the other casinos. And we're seeing these cyber attacks all the time. And that's my theory, my
Mm,
working
mm.
theory
I
is
think
that,
you're absolutely right. That is definitely another scenario, and they've been working on this. We had this World Economic Forum
right.
warning and so on. So definitely, I think that's also um, one scenario, and we'll have to see which one they're going to go for. But it will be one of these methods. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now, why did the World Economic Forum, we've got to address this, Richard, not to grill you here, but why did they in 2003 call you what was it they called you?
But they gave me this. They awarded me Global Leader for Tomorrow. And
That's
there's
it.
around, I
That's
don't know
it.
how many people, there's like 60 people or whatever every year. They had the system. You had to be
Okay.
below 40 of age and had done something promising, whatever, and you were selected. And I was selected, I was invited. And officially, it meant, and then, you get this information in writing. You'll be invited for 5 years. You can engage like those guys who go there, and they have to pay $50,000, $100,000 to go there, right?
Mm,
But I went there without having to pay that, as a global leader for tomorrow. And of course, it was exciting because you meet all these guys, shake hands with the American president, Bill Clinton, and all the famous people. Some from media, um,
that's exciting to you. It's not
Peter
exciting.
Gabriel, and you meet. And they
Yeah.
introduced Angela Merkel to me. Somebody said, "Oh, you must meet this lady." She wasn't chancellor yet, you see.
Yeah.
You must meet this person. I thought, like, why? She's so uncharismatic and boring.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But clearly, some people knew that she was going to be put in that position. Anyway, so you have these opportunities, and then they expect that you play ball and
Yeah.
you sort of essentially suck up to all these. But I I just I asked very critical questions, and whenever somebody was speaking nonsense, I would say, "Well, hang on, that's not correct because."
Yeah.
And what about this? And there was a few instances where I suppose they actively disliked my questions and the things I would say. So after a while, then the moderators in these sessions would just not call me up. I could raise my hand and be the only one, and they wouldn't notice me.
Yeah,
And
sure.
they weren't very big groups. Um, and then at one stage there was, I think it was a session hosted by Martin Wolf from the Financial Times, and there was the
Yeah, yeah.
the president of the ECB talking, and he was talking all this nonsense. I mean, this central bank uh, story. In fact, it's the same story as they've been marketing in Japan. So the central bank was saying we need structural reform, deregulation, liberalization, privatization, and the recession is due to you guys not doing this. And Germany needs to do this deregulation, liberalization, privatization, labor market. We need to
Sure, sure.
destroy unions. And so then I just asked, well, where in the mandate of the ECB does it say that that it has this job, this mandate to engineer structural reform and ask for structural changes? And you can
Mm,
see his response. It was actually cut into this YouTube
yeah.
documentary called Princes of the Yen. His response was somewhat so initially he was like, "Oh, but no, it's not our mandate, and I'm just saying that as advice." But while he was talking, he sort of realized that he wasn't very convincing. It's really,
Right. Yeah, I
really
saw
funny
I saw
to.
the clip. Yeah, I did see it. Yeah, yeah.
And so anyway, the conclusion was, so actually they invited me the second year, 2004, but then they had enough, and so soon after this January 2004 World Economic Forum gathering in Davos, an email came around to all the global leaders for tomorrow saying, unfortunately, this program, Global Leader for Tomorrow, has been cancelled and you won't be invited anymore. Sorry, bye bye. And then it turned out a few months later, they just invented a new program called Young Global Leader.
That's
It sounds
correct.
very similar.
That's correct.
That's the one they're still running today. And
Yeah.
they selected, they were a bit more selective, and I wasn't part of the new selection. That's how they ex-invited some critical voices.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. Well, at least we know you're not a WEF member. This was 20 years ago. You went to a conference and they basically kicked you out. Okay, so let's good. We've got that out of the way. Otherwise, not only are you going to be dragged through the comments, but I will as well. You brought on a WEF, all this sort of craziness. Okay, let's come back to banks then. And when we think about commercial banks and their role um, with central banks, because central banks right now, in terms of, government bonds and treasuries and things like that, you need these commercial banks, you need the intermediaries, you need all of these, the system, how it works right now. But what I've been talking about is how when the CBDC comes in, unless the banks make their own digital token and network, there's not going to be any requirement for intermediaries anymore that I can see. I want to know from your perspective if you can see any requirement for them. So what I think is most likely is that the banks, then commercial banks, will make their own sort of network token in order to not get wiped out by the CBDCs. Now, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, the big banks are likely to get co-opted into it, and because basically the leadership of the big banks seem to be very collusive. Um, they probably are given other jobs and prospects. It seems in the UK, Lloyds Bank is told, well, why don't you become a property owner as your
Yes.
new business model? So Lloyds is buying up all the properties. We see in America, banks buying real estate and it's becoming sort of property owners, managers. But it is surprising and very disappointing that the banks aren't fighting for themselves. At one stage, I contacted in the UK the big banks, in order to forge an alliance by saying that, well, we know you guys are hated by the public, and when the push comes to shove and CBDCs are introduced and then the banks have to go, the public is not going to stand up for you guys. But I'm trying to introduce community banks
Yes.
that will have public support. And if you guys support us, invest in setting up some community banks, that will then later help you when there will be this criticism and there will be the movement to abolish banks. Because if there's community banks, then the banks are likely to survive.
Yes.
But there was no reaction, and they didn't really feel like they needed to engage. Maybe it was slightly too early. That was 2017, 18, maybe too early, and they just thought that it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe one should try again now because I'm working on raising money for the Winchester Community Bank, Hampshire Business Bank, as a sort of pilot to then roll this out across the UK and other countries as well, looking at other countries, buying a bank in Europe is one of the projects and looking for investors for these. Because really, we need local small banks that are accountable locally and are meaningfully accountable, which is possible when the bank is small.
Yes.
Because the decision by a bank is so important. I mean, how much are they going to lend? Because this is money creation. Who are they going to give this newly created money and for what purpose?
Mm.
Sadly, the regulators have really encouraged property lending because they like these boom bust cycles. The Basel rules really encourage property lending, and you get punished as a bank if you lend to businesses, to small firms for productive business investment. You have to have more capital, which is why the big banks aren't doing it. So we need to set up small banks, community banks that are actually lending to small firms. Small firms account for most of the employment. Two-thirds of employment is small and medium-sized enterprises, and the
Right.
banks are not interested. Well, that's crazy. Let's set up banks dedicated to this. It's actually the safest lending. There's never been a banking crisis. Have you ever heard of a banking crisis due to too much lending to SMEs? There's no such thing. It doesn't exist because it is the best lending because they have income streams to service and repay the loans. You have banking crisis based on property lending because that's capital gains. It's not really intrinsic income. It's capital gains that's driving these boom bust cycles, and that means you get these crises. So,
Yeah.
but I hope, yeah. So I hope, I should maybe try again with the big banks where they're going to support us a bit. But they are, um, I mean, they have been very disappointing in either not seeing that they are now being targeted by the central planners, and really they should be on our side if they want to survive. And we don't need to abolish them. Let's just have an alternative, and then people have choices. You can still stay with the big bank if you want, but hey, here's a local community bank. I think that's what we should offer.
As you were talking before, my brain just fires up with ideas all the time. And something came through my mind, and I thought, I wonder if that would be possible. So I've talked about how the banks are going out and buying huge developments like BlackRock and Vanguard and New State Street and some of the others. Lloyd's, as you alluded to in the UK, these want to be the biggest landlords across those countries now. Lloyd's wants to be the biggest landlord in the UK. It's madness. And what I thought of was, I wonder if they could do, how we had, BTOs, bespoke tranche opportunities and things like that with bringing mortgages together and such like. I wonder if banks can buy property with either peer to, bank to bank lending or within their own remits. Is that legally possible? Could they do that? Or do you know? I mean, this is
So
quite,
the banks buy properties.
yeah, without, yeah. So could they start just buying every piece of property, every house, every condo, everything that comes to market? Could the banks just start buying all of this with created money? Have you ever thought about that theory?
Of course, no, of course, banks can do that. I mean, banks can, in fact, banks are in the business. I mean, banks, economists always say banks take deposits and lend money. But the legal and actual reality is banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. The
Correct.
reason is that at law, there's no such thing as a bank deposit. That
Yes.
actually is simply a loan we give to the bank. So they
Correct.
are borrowing money from us and they don't lend money, they purchase securities. The loan contract is a promissory note, a debt
Yeah.
instrument that the borrower is issuing and they're buying it. But they can buy other securities and they can buy property. They can buy anything. They can buy assets. So yes, they can do it, and that is what Lloyd's is doing.
Yeah. And I guess my question around that was, could, say, Lloyd's work with another banking group and they just lend to one another huge sums of money to buy even more property? Would that be legal under the banking code?
Um, so you're referring to the fact that a bank creates money when it gives a loan,
Yes,
and so it
correct.
needs a strong and a counterparty who is actually borrowing the money, which
Correct.
is the example of what Credit Suisse did, and some people pointing to Barclays as well.
Mm,
In the 2008 crisis, where the banks, some banks created their own capital by
correct.
lending to somebody. They need a counterparty. It needs to be big and sort of look okay, which was the Qatar, Sheikh of Qatar sovereign wealth
Yeah.
fund,
Yeah. Yeah.
and sort of 10 billion. And then the loan creates the money, and with that, then preference shares were bought, which at the time was still allowed as tier one capital for banks. Um, and so you create your own capital. And somehow that was signed off by the Swiss regulators. And, if Barclays did that, well, nothing happened. I mean, there was a bit of a probe, but it was sort of scratching the surface, not really tackling this point. Um, so, and so you're referring to that in the sense there needs to be a counterparty to borrow. And of course, that can be easily organized. You can have a consortium that
Yes.
includes various players and also some banks, and then they can take the loan, and so uh, you can sort of slightly make it less visible
Mm,
and also more acceptable legally because there is a an article in the Companies Act 2006 which says any company, not just the bank, must not lend money to the buyer of your shares, of the
yeah.
company's shares, which of course is particularly interesting when you're a bank because that's how you create your own capital. Um, but that can be circumvented by having, yeah, other counterparties and having a group of, and mutual actions
Yeah.
and transactions. So that is possible, I think.
Yeah, because that's what I was just thinking as as you were talking about you could see a massive crash in property prices and you could see this, the CB. I was thinking, now, would that actually happen? Yes, and then the banks could come in and swoop up everything. And if they don't have enough capital themselves because of the crash that's going through the economy, well, maybe they could create some sort of consortium legally, or maybe there's a new law that's passed, or maybe there's already a loophole somewhere that involves them just coming in, scooping up everything, even shares in companies. I know it's not strictly legal right now, but maybe something could pass, and you could see just a massive grab of
Yeah,
assets that
yeah,
have come
yeah,
down. And this is one way we could see something like this coming about. Yeah, interesting,
yeah.
interesting. And that's why it's good to speak sometimes, because new ideas come to the surface. Okay, and I know you've got to run now then, but in terms of two things then, number one, how do we stop CBDCs? I'm also writing a post in my community about avoiding CBDCs. Should we not be able to stop it? So that, and then just tell people how they can find out more information about you very briefly. So we'll wrap up with that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, I think CBDCs are so dangerous because they are a totalitarian control system where you're in a digital prison. It's not even money. They call it currency, but it's conditional money. Essentially, each time you have to send an application to the bureaucrat. May I please use this money now in this place, in this location, physical location for this purpose to buy this and that. That's what you're doing. And they can decide. And if you're a person of interest, they will probably have some guys watching and decide. Otherwise, you'll just have get some algorithm decide for you. And I suspect there's not going to be any recourse and the process of appealing. And it's nonsense anyway. We shouldn't have to beg to be allowed to use our money. But this is where this is heading. Look at the social credit scoring thing, carbon footprint, and all that stuff. And so how our transactions will link to some kind of agenda, and there will be an approval process that will have to go very quickly, which is why I think they are probably working with AI and algorithms. But it's a disaster because this will mean a complete control. Remember how the Ottawa truckers' peaceful demonstrations was stopped? They gave us, a glance into the planned future. They didn't have CBDC, so they had to actually pass a law that forced the banks to then listen to the government telling them, okay, we've got facial recognition. We know all these people now in this demonstration. Freeze their accounts now. They can't buy a cup of tea. They can't buy food. That's it. And this is what happened. And within, a couple of days, that's it. They had to leave because you have to eat. They didn't have enough cash. So, of course,
Yeah.
we should stock up on cash, have a bit of silver and gold, I guess. But most important, we must prevent the introduction of CBDCs. This is really an issue that we should go out onto the streets for. We should organize demonstrations in front of central banks in particular. They don't expect this. They think, oh, it's so technical. We technocrats, that's how we do things. We talk technical, we issue some technical paper, and people think, oh, this is beyond me. No, this is really very important now. It's a control tool. You don't really need to understand the details, but we must stop it and we must get mobilized and demonstrate. I think they will shy away from it because the technocrats aren't used to direct opposition. Governments, yes, they have demonstrations and prime ministers, they're used to demonstrations against them. Central banks, when has there been a demonstration against central bank policies? You see, it happens too rarely. It's time to do it now. So that would be my call.
Mm.
Otherwise, information about me, there's my website, professorwerner.org. There's my two Twitter accounts. I'm still calling it Twitter, at Professor Werner at Professor Werner, and the other one is at Scientific Econ, because I'm trying to do scientific economics. And there's my YouTube channel, Werner Economics. And also, I am, well, one of my former students is actually trying to set up a token system that the Valhalla network that will support the establishment of community banks. I am a chairman of Local First Community Interest Company, local-first.org.uk, trying to set up community banks and local banks, and I'm involved in some bank projects. So anyone interested, please do get in touch. The website, professorwerner.org, has email addresses.
Great, great. And of course, your book, don't forget your book, Princes of
Oh,
Yen.
yes, indeed. Princes of the Yen, you can get at quantumpublishers.com. Get it directly there. It's tricky to get it otherwise and overpriced.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Professor Richard Werner, for coming online. Really appreciate it. And other than that, we'll have another call again. If people enjoy this enough, we just need to drop a comment below if you want to have Richard back again. And apart from that, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I hope I can come again. Thanks.
Great.